Let's just talk about that's scorched.
Since you ruined it already.
The others are subtle. This is you know hit you over the head, and we were trying to be subtle, but we can't. You know, you can't safely get coffee to scorch in a drum. I mean, when we did a roasted thing, we were trying to scorch coffee, and I had a Probatino, which you could do that. We were messing up the batch size, and we were doing everything we could to scorch. We couldn't get visible scorching at all. So eventually, since it wasn't my roaster, I just turned off the drum. But it said, yeah, and that's really not good. I mean, you're going to warp your drum, and especially a Probatino. So, and you tried to scorch on this, right?
Mm-hmm. We did a little bit, just a really high drop temp. I mean, that's generally where you can get scorching. Another thing,
yeah.
I mean, sometimes scorching is less of a problem with roaster error, operator error, and more to do with the roaster itself in terms of, it could be an airflow issue or also a drum speed issue. Sometimes, you know, people think, oh, well, slower drum speed means that the coffee isn't, you know, being churned so much, so there's more contact time. But actually, you can get centrifuging on a roaster drum at a much lower RPM than you would imagine, like in the 60s.
So you mean pushing the coffee against the
outside,
pushing the
coffee
so it doesn't drop off the wall as it should and get. Yeah.
So it's just getting prolonged, and you know, scorching is a conductive transfer defect. It's happening from contact with the surface. Or
what about facing?
Facing happens at the end of a roast. No, this is an important distinction because this coffee features both. Scorching is, and a lot of the problems that lead to one lead to the other. But scorching is when you burn the green coffee, you know, before any kind of development. So right at the beginning of the roast. Whereas facing generally happens at the end of the roast when the coffee's broken down.
Okay.
So actually,
I know some of the roasters people are using here, and I mean, I would characterize our roaster pretty stock L12, you know, as, you know, it does a good roast, but I think of it like roasting in a small room, like a closet. You don't have a lot of area to move one way or the other, so I think you can get good results, but you can't step outside of that a lot. I mean, when you go over to the whole other end of the spectrum, like fluidized bed roasting, where you could turn coffee brown in 45 seconds to 3 minutes. I mean, you can make coffee do all kinds of horrible things. Actually, scorching isn't one of them. It's usually just raw on the inside and roast on the outside. But you know, it's kind of hard to get those really bad results. But you know, we've all tasted coffee and known that it's possible. So we actually had to go over to my house and take a brass pan roaster that I have from turn of the century, and put this on a burner with really hot temperature, and we got great scorching. We put a little thing on Instagram. You can see how good our scorching was.
I would say though, and definitely you taste the scorching, and it's more in the aftertaste for me. But this cup I feel is more dominated by the under-roasted coffee.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, I feel like there's just a lot more cereal flavors in it.
Raw.
Yeah, totally.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, yeah, we had a huge range of roasts. So we didn't want to create like this cartoonish kind of roast thing where we do these really extreme things. So that kind of belongs a little bit to that thing, and we wanted to be more subtle. I think we did better over on the rest of these.
And it's good to kind of get that.
I didn't do anything.
It's good to get that one kind of out of the way, since that is kind of the outlier and such. And it's fun to like put into the context of the rest of this thing. But we really should have started with the control anyway to talk about that. Just kind of get everybody's impressions of the coffee in and of itself. And that base roast. What are some of the features of the control roast?
I mean, maybe because you said these things, but like very just like sweet, clean, like soft like apple-like acidity maybe, but just like a very just even coffee.
Even,
nothing,
balanced.
Yeah. Nothing just like, nothing wild, but like.
So that's the kind of idea with, you know, these kind of experiments, is starting at a balance point, you know, starting in the middle. And the way I always think about it with this experiment is kind of your ideal roast range should have that kind of shape on the palate in terms of this kind of the peaks and valleys. That centralized acidity. Having that centralized acidity just gives you this kind of three-dimensional taste experience. You get a long sweet finish because it's not overwhelmed by the brightness. So your perceived acidity is kind of right in the middle of the palate, which allows you to get some nice flavor at the front of the palate, but then the finish is also not overwhelmed by that. And so that's kind of what I like to keep in mind when I'm like trying to find that base. So, the third coffee here. Who wants to guess which coffee this was? What do you think it was? Which coffee do you think this was?
That one.
That one? You thought it was that one?
I really like the balance in this coffee. For me, it was my favorite because it's creamy, nice,
mouthfeel,
mouthfeel, acidity, and sweetness, almost like cherry. Yeah, it's very good development.
I think the mouthfeel is definitely one of the big elements of that cup.
I thought it was either maybe fast or number 2, whatever. See, but how can I say it? That's
It's number 2, so it's a little bit.
That number 2 flavor in it. I'm going to use that on our next, review. Yeah, this has a lot.
This tastes a lot like number 2.
I think that's where the control says something about. I mean, I ran into this problem on the toughest upstairs. Is that I was drawn to that because of the amount of perceived acidity, where it's kind of a low acid coffee. I mean, it has nice acidity. It's moderate, like you said, it's soft. But I still was drawn to the faster roast because there's a little bit more perceived acidity in the non-acidic.
So what happened with this coffee in the roast is that I was trying to I wanted to do both some really subtle stretching out to kind of show that there's this kind of more acceptable range for coffee. And then also be able to show the more extreme stretching out and shortening of the roast. And what happened is this had a stretched out drying stage. We added about a full minute to the drying stage of this roast, but we ended up making it up at the end of the roast. So it ended up being about the same amount of time. It's the same amount of time. So number 2 here, it's a 13-minute roast, just like our control batch was, but with slightly different time. And so I think comparatively, it's not a giant jump, but I still think that they're very different coffees. And I think the most telling thing is there's just more kind of more texture in the front of the palate, just a little bit more of a creamier mouthfeel, and so that slightly longer development at the very beginning of the roast kind of gave us just a little bit more of a boosted mouthfeel. And so when I talk about development, this is kind of important because I get a lot of emails about
The number
development.
2 is a tad lighter too, so I mean,
A tad lighter than the control in the grounds.
Yeah.
yeah. So
A tad.
Technical.
So I get a lot of people, traditionally when people have talked about roast development, they're generally talking about the time immediately after the end of first crack. That's the traditional sense of, that's the roast development time. But it's kind of, a funny thing to say because you're getting development throughout the entirety of the roast. And so I like to talk about development at different stages of the roast. The idea of that time after first crack being the development stage of it really misleads a lot of roasters when they're starting out into adding all this extra time at that point of the roast, and it actually really flattens out coffee. And it's actually, you can do what we did, all of the stretching or quickening of the roasts that we did for this experiment happened during the drying stage of the roast, not post first crack. And the thing is, when you're adding that development, you can get similar results. And when I did articles for Sweet Marina's Coffee Shrub of stretching out the roast, I did stretches after first crack compared to stretches during the drying stage. And they were fairly similar profiles at the end of the day. Like doing it then or doing it later was very similar. But adding that stretching time at the end of the roast was also just a lot more dangerous. It's a lot sketchier to add time during that part of the roast. you're just risking a lot more with doing that. So if you want to like make some adjustments to your roasting profile or whatever, I would definitely kind of recommend looking at doing that during the drying stage of the roast first. Number 4, the fourth roast on the table.
Yes. I got
Danny,
this.
what do you think of it?
I have to try it again.
Do it,
It's been a
man.
while.
Do it. We're waiting.
Sorry.
What
Was it
did-
on stretch?
You think it was the stretch roast?
Yeah, it's a
What
little
would
bit
lead
more.
you to think that?
What's that?
What makes you make that?
A little bit more dense.
little dense?
Chocolatey notes start to come out a little bit more. I guess caramel notes.
More dominant.
Yeah,
you know,
definitely. Like a
with-
chocolatey, thick creaminess. I
I kind of
guess.
love that you're saying this, and I hate to tell you both that you're totally wrong.
Okay.
This is the shortened roast.
Okay.
But what you're describing in terms of that density, that's the perfect description for what's going on here. Only what's happening is that everything in this roast is at the front of the palate. So it has density because you experience everything at one time. I always kind of equate this, when I'm talking about this with people, I always say it's kind of like shoving a brick through a pinhole. It's just like everything's right there at the front of your palate. So at almost every time I've done this experiment, and I've done this a number of times with a bunch of different groups, and every time there's a good part of the group thinks that this is the kind of denser, more full-bodied coffee. But if you go back and taste it now, we're kind of getting down to the dregs there. But you'll notice it's really at the front of the palate, and it's really drying. It's actually kind of drying in the finish, and it's kind of almost vapid. There's nothing in the finish. It's all right at the front of the palate, and it's that acidity. And so that's one of those things where perceived acidity really leads to what we consider to be mouthfeel, because that acidity, there's a physicality to where you experience that on the palate. And getting it on the front gives you this idea that this is a bigger bodied coffee.
Well, that's interesting because those are both tactile. The tactile sensation of acidity, being also, I think one of the things that we were talking about a lot, and I don't know if you guys have seen it, but is that if you were able to accurately visually measure the exterior color versus interior, then when you start to get a greater separation between those two, meaning you've had less interior development in the coffee because of a faster roast and more exterior color, that would be just a symptom of it, that you start to, draw out, you're not flattening the coffee, you're actually broadening it to some degree, and with some coffees that would be really desirable to kind of bring out that perceived acidity.
Right.
Because...
Well, that's the whole idea. This is the tool that we're giving you here with this experiment, is when you understand perceived acidity and being able to manipulate that in the roast, it really gives you a completely different tool in terms of how you approach a coffee. If you have something that maybe doesn't have brilliant acidity, you can push it a little bit to try to get it to pop out a little bit more. Or otherwise, if you have something that is way too bright, you can kind of mute it down.
But the application that you're going to use for the coffee too, right?
Right.
Thinking
Oh,
about using
espresso.
that roast out for espresso, right? That's kind of hitting the mark because you're messing with the brightness a little bit. I think you're still.
Well, traditional espresso
Like you
too.
said the first time, like it's a better expression of the mouth.
Yeah.
It's a little silky on the tongue, but it has like that kind of a nice little grittiness.
Well, and if you're trying to bring out a specific element that you're going to put into the espresso and you want that to stand out, if you're building the base of an espresso, and traditionally, espresso roasts were longer roasts, 18 to 20 minute roasts. And in fact, like the Diedrich machine, the technology that went into those IR burners developed in the mid to late 80s. At the first big push expansion of espresso use in the United States. So their whole approach to designing that roaster was to do these kind of drawn out, kind of stretched out, longer roasts to help produce these big, like syrupy body equipment. Not like the more kind of bright, brilliant espressos that we're used to today, but these really like syrupy mouthfeels. And that's the thing, if you know anybody or if any of you are roasting on a Dietrich, you know, it's a great thing to compare that to Probot in terms of that, you know, the viscosity of the coffee.
Do you think you get more starch development in a roast like that?
Probably not. It's probably more halted development. And generally development in a roast is breaking down. You're breaking it down, right? So in that regard, you're maybe bringing that out more because you're not breaking it down as much. And that's kind of the thing in doing the research behind the stretching out the roast articles. I did stretching out after first crack, stretching out during the first crack itself, and then stretching out during the drying stage. And the stretching during the drying stage compared to stretching post first crack was fairly, you know, the results were fairly similar, like I was saying before. Stretching out during the first crack itself during that event, one, it's dangerous for one reason that we'll talk about in a minute here. But it's also, what's happening is you're adding this time, this breakdown time to that point in the roast where the coffee is at its most elastic, and you're actually breaking down the cellulose of it. So you have you're kind of developing non-sugar carbohydrates, and so you're actually developing body. Like you're literally like making more tactility to be dissolved when you brew it. So that's like really, if you really want to affect mouthfeel, doing some stretching during the middle of during the first crack is actually a little bit more useful in that regard. But again, then you're talking about tactility as opposed to perceived acidity and what that does to the dynamics of taste. That being said, what does everybody think
I
this one
think
is?
we also need to say at this point, you should stretch before you roast and after you roast.
I was going to do that when we were done talking about this. We were going to stretch out the roaster.
Stretching out the roaster, okay.
We're stretching out the roast, and then we're stretching out the roaster.
Okay.
We just killed that one. We slayed that one. All right, who wants to talk about this coffee? Danny was like totally went and hid behind me. After I called on him the last time.
Yeah.
That's what I did at the Globetrotters game. When they were like,
I think this is a baked roast. It still had sweetness. It still had good body. It just on the finish was flat. Whereas the next, well, I guess I can talk about the next one because they're both.
Yeah.
This is I think the stretched one. It was sweeter. It didn't fall off as hard at the end. So they both had sweetness though, less acidity.
it's good to talk about them together because if you look at our long roast compared to the baked roast, they were around the same time. But again, different slightly different development. Are there any other features in this that really stand out to you? Caramel?
Carbon.
Carbon,
yeah.
A little bit roastier.
I call it acrid.
Yeah, acrid is great.
Bad.
I think
chocolate.
it's really aspiriny too. And
Oh, really?
yeah, I get a really there's a hardness in the middle of this cup, no matter whether it's carbon or acrid or if it's more kind of aspirin, depending on how you experience it. But I feel like this is a really important thing to look at because, and especially in comparison, obviously, process of elimination makes this the stretched roast. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But for a long time, baked is kind of used as a blanket term for generally this kind of profile, or even more flattened out. There's just like what we used to call overdevelopment, but since there's no actual like perfect development, at least defined by anybody, it's kind of hard to say like what's over and what's under and blah blah blah. But traditionally, like the stretched out profile is more of that overdevelopment or just the flattening of the coffee. And just like, you know, with the shorter roast, we had that. With the longer roast, it's either flatlined or more of a gentle smoke, or maybe sometimes a little bit of brightness in the finish. I feel like in this one, there's a little bit of brightness still present in the finish, so it's not completely flattened out. But you can kind of see. I mean, it's crazy because when you start thinking about it this way, you really are, you know, physically moving the perceived acidity across the palate, and it's affecting you. So we have it in the front that way, in the middle in the control, and then all the way in the finish in this stretched out roast. But that flattening of a coffee is not baked. Bake is a very particular roast defect. And what baking is when you've stalled caramelization. So right around 380 degrees to 400 degrees, when you're starting to engage in the first crack, is when you're also engaging in caramelization, when caramelization starts. And if you were to either plateau that process in terms of halting your rate of rise at all and just kind of staying at the same temperature, right, hovering right around that temperature, but even worse is if you actually fall in temperature. And it's manifested in this really harsh flavor in the coffee, and it's definitely there, but I've had it, like, this one we were only able to, the L12 just has so much crazy momentum that to get it to actually stall in the middle of first crack was a task, you know. But we got it to stall, and I think it's evident in here we get that hard flavor. But if you were to actually dip back down in temperature, dipping under 400 again, it becomes even a harder, like oaty or more cereal, different from like the underdeveloped cereal, really like hard cereal or sometimes even like a popcorn flavor. So baked is something really particular, and it's really important to be able to pick that out as opposed to the stretched out roast.